Most of the companies in this history end the same dramatic way. A single bankruptcy filing, a single conglomerate takeover, a single week when the factory gates close for good, and every employee finds out at once, usually followed by a turnaround firm, a courtroom, and a final auction of whatever equipment is left standing. Van Norman did not die that way. It spent roughly 60 years, quietly shedding pieces of itself, one product line at a time, to a rotating cast of buyers, most of whom had no connection to the original company or to each other, until there was no single Van Norman left at all, just a handful of small, unrelated businesses scattered across the American Midwest, several of them still stamping the Van Norman name onto tools and machines sold to auto repair shops that have no idea whose century-old name they're actually buying. There was no single dramatic ending here. No headline, no bankruptcy court. Just a slow, almost invisible unraveling that took longer than most of the companies in this history managed to survive in the first place. This is a company that started by fixing pocket watches, ended up building the machines that let mechanics rebuild an engine without ever pulling it out of the car, and then dissolved so gradually and so quietly that almost nobody noticed the exact moment it actually stopped existing. The story begins in Waltham, Massachusetts, around 1874, when two brothers, Charles E. and Fred D. Van Norman, started a small operation called the Hopkins Watch Tool Company. Waltham at the time was the undisputed center of the American watchmaking industry, home to the Waltham Watch Company and a dense cluster of smaller firms supplying it with tools, components, and precision instruments. And the Van Normans built their first products for exactly that trade: watch repair lathes, and the small precision tooling that went with them. Delicate work measured in fractions of a millimeter that demanded the same kind of exacting tolerances the brothers would spend the rest of their careers chasing at a dramatically larger scale. In 1883, the brothers bought the rights to a related name, the Waltham Watch Tool Company, at a moment when the company that had originally held that name was pivoting into full watch production under a new name of its own, the U.S. Watch Company, leaving its old tool-making identity available for the Van Normans to claim. It was around that same time that the Van Normans relocated their growing operation to Springfield, Massachusetts, roughly 70 miles west, a city already home to the Springfield Armory and a substantial base of skilled metalworking labor built up over generations of firearms manufacturing, exactly the kind of trained workforce a growing precision toolmaker would need to draw on as it expanded beyond its original watchmaking niche. And Springfield would remain the company's home for the next century. For years, the firm continued making the fine, tooling its watchmaking customers depended on, adapting slowly as that trade itself began to consolidate around a handful of larger manufacturers. But in 1890, it built its first Van Norman milling machine, a decision that would eventually redefine the entire business and pull it decisively away from its watchmaking roots. The formal transition became official in 1914, when the company reorganized under the name it would carry for most of its history, the Van Norman Machine Tool Company. That same year, 1914, the firm introduced its first oscillating grinding machine, and the timing mattered enormously because the ball and roller bearing industry was expanding rapidly at exactly that moment to meet the demands of the rapidly growing automobile trade, and bearings need an extraordinarily precise, extraordinarily round ground surface to run smoothly and quietly for any meaningful length of time. An oscillating grinder solves a problem that a simple rotating grinding wheel cannot solve well on its own. If a grinding wheel simply spins against a curved surface in one fixed plane, the abrasive tends to wear unevenly across its own face, and that uneven wear can transfer directly onto the workpiece, leaving faint, repeating grooves or a slightly inconsistent finish running along the length of the part. An imperfection that matters little on a rough casting but matters enormously on a bearing race expected to run smoothly for tens of thousands of hours. Van Norman's oscillating grinders added a controlled back and forth motion along the axis of the workpiece, superimposed on the wheel's normal rotation, which spread the wheel's wear evenly across its entire face, rather than concentrating it in one narrow band, and let the machine finish a cylindrical bearing race or ball track to a far more uniform roundness and surface finish than a fixed plane grinder could reliably produce. Van Norman's oscillating grinders were soon being sold to many of the world's leading ball and roller bearing manufacturers, a business that had nothing at all to do with pocket watches and everything to do with the automotive economy that was just beginning its explosive growth across America in the years leading up to the First World War. Van Norman's other major contribution to the general machine tool trade was its line of what became known as ram-type milling machines. Most milling machines of the era were built as either horizontal machines, with the cutting spindle running sideways through the workpiece, or vertical machines, with the spindle pointing straight down onto it, and a shop that needed to do both kinds of work typically needed two separate machines, doubling both the capital outlay and the floor space required for what was, in many cases, a fairly modest volume of work on either type. Van Norman's ram-type design used a swiveling head mounted on an adjustable ram, so the same physical machine could be reconfigured from a horizontal spindle arrangement to a vertical one, and back again in a matter of minutes, rather than requiring an entirely separate piece of equipment sitting idle most of the time. A genuinely useful piece of flexibility for a smaller shop that could not justify owning two dedicated machines for two closely related jobs. The ram-type mills were built for decades in an enormous range of sizes, from the small, home shop-friendly number 6, light enough for an individual hobbyist or small repair shop to own, all the way up to the 9,000-pound number 38, a genuinely substantial piece of industrial equipment, alongside heavier horizontal mills built for larger production work, and a smaller, dedicated vertical machine built specifically for the fine, precise work of tool and die making. Machinists who worked with the line for decades afterward would specifically remember the versatility of the swiveling ram design as the feature that set Van Norman's mills apart from more rigidly single-purpose competitors. But it was Van Norman's third line of business, one that had nothing to do with either watches or general-purpose milling machines, that ended up defining the company's lasting reputation and giving this video its reason for existing. As the automobile went from novelty to necessity across American life in the first decades of the 20th century, an entire secondary industry grew up around keeping those millions of engines running long after they left the factory. The automotive repair and engine rebuilding trade, a trade that would eventually employ far more mechanics in far more scattered small shops than the automakers themselves ever directly employed on their own assembly lines. Van Norman pioneered a piece of equipment that solved one of that trade's most expensive and time-consuming problems. Before Van Norman's innovation, Reboring a worn engine cylinder back to fresh, precise dimensions generally meant pulling the entire engine out of the vehicle, hoisting it onto a stand, and sending the bare block across town to a specialized machine shop equipped with a stationary boring mill. A process that could tie up a customer's car for the better part of a week and add substantial labor cost to what was, mechanically speaking, a relatively straightforward repair once the block was actually in front of the right machine. Van Norman built a portable boring bar rig that turned that entire process inside out. The rig clamped directly onto the engine block itself, right there in the chassis. Using the block's own deck surface or main bearing bores as a fixed, known reference point rather than requiring a separate precision fixture, and then guided a precision boring bar carrying an adjustable cutting head straight down through the worn cylinder, slowly and steadily cutting it back to a fresh, true, perfectly round bore, all without the engine ever leaving the car it was bolted into. For a repair shop, that meant a job that once required pulling an engine, shipping a block across town, and waiting days for a specialized machine shop to finish it could now be done in place in a single visit on equipment the shop itself owned and operated on its own schedule. It transformed engine reboring from a rare, expensive specialty job, farmed out to a small number of dedicated machine shops in any given city, into a routine service almost any reasonably equipped general repair garage could offer its own customers directly, and in doing so, it created an entirely new category of machine tool customer that Van Norman had essentially invented for itself. Not an automobile manufacturer building engines from scratch on a factory assembly line, the customer every other builder in this history had spent decades chasing, but an ordinary neighborhood repair shop keeping existing, already sold engines alive for another 100,000 miles. Van Norman built an entire toolkit around that same core idea over the following decades, expanding well beyond the original portable boring bar into nearly every corner of what a working engine rebuilding shop actually needed on its own floor. Crankshaft grinders and cam grinders to true up the internal rotating parts of a worn engine back to their original precise dimensions. Rotary broaches and valve refacers to restore a cylinder head's worn valve seats to a proper gas-tight seal. Brake lathes to resurface worn brake drums and rotors rather than replace them outright. And rotary flywheel grinders to true up a worn flywheel face rather than scrap the entire part. None of these machines were glamorous, and none of them built the kind of record-setting, largest in the world machine tool that companies like Cincinnati Milling or Ingersoll built their early public reputations on. The sort of achievement that made headlines and got photographed for trade magazines. But together, they made Van Norman the name stamped on an enormous share of the actual working equipment inside American engine rebuilding shops for most of the 20th century. A quieter, more durable kind of industrial relevance than building one spectacular machine every few decades. The sort of ubiquity that shows up not in headlines, but in how many small-town garages, truck fleets, and independent machine shops kept at least one Van Norman machine running somewhere on the premises for 40 or 50 years at a stretch. By December 1942, in the middle of wartime production, Van Norman employed 2,779 people at its Springfield plant, a genuinely substantial workforce by any ordinary standard, if considerably smaller than giants like Cincinnati Milling's nearly 6,900 employees, or Brown & Sharp's roughly 6,200 that same year, placing Van Norman solidly among the second tier of established, respected American machine tool builders, alongside firms like Gisholt and Monarch, rather than among the small handful of true industry giants that dominated the trade's headlines. The broader engine rebuilding trade Van Norman helped equip would go on to become one of the more durable corners of American manufacturing, precisely because it did not depend on selling new equipment to automakers. An industry with a small number of enormous customers, each negotiating hard on price, but instead sold repeatedly to tens of thousands of small independent repair shops across the entire country, each one a modest but steady customer for replacement grinding wheels, cutting tools, and eventually replacement parts for the machines themselves. That structural difference, a fragmented base of small, loyal customers, rather than a handful of powerful original equipment buyers, is a meaningful part of why pieces of Van Norman's product lines were still commercially viable enough to be worth buying individually, decades after the parent company itself had stopped functioning as a single business. The post-war decades kept that same dual identity intact. General machine tools on one side, specialized automotive service equipment on the other. But the balance between those two businesses was quietly shifting the entire time, even as the company's public reputation stayed remarkably stable. In the early 1960s, Van Norman was acquired by the Universal American Corporation, and surviving machines from this period carried tags identifying them as products of the Van Norman Machine Company, a division of Universal American Corporation, rather than as products of an independent firm. A small but telling change in the wording stamped onto every casting the company shipped from that point forward. Universal American, in turn, later merged into Gulf and Western Industries, the sprawling 1960s and 1970s conglomerate that would become far better known in later decades for owning Paramount Pictures and a controlling stake in the sugar industry of the Dominican Republic than for owning any machine tool company at all. A genuinely strange corporate landing spot for a firm that had started out repairing pocket watches in Waltham, Massachusetts, 90 years earlier, and a landing spot that made it entirely unsurprising that the actual machine tool business itself would receive less and less strategic attention the deeper it sat inside a conglomerate whose real interest lay in entertainment and consumer goods. Somewhere around the same period, the general machine tool side of Van Norman's business, the Ram-type mills that had once been the company's proudest general-purpose product, began quietly fading from the center of the company's attention. By the mid-1960s, machines still carrying the Van Norman name were, according to accounts from machinists who worked directly with the equipment and later corresponded with the company's own engineering staff about replacement parts, actually being manufactured under contract by a separate firm, the Atlantic Machine Tool Works, rather than by Van Norman itself, meaning the company had effectively become a brand and a sales channel for its own flagship product line, rather than the actual manufacturer of it. A large bridge-type milling machine built around 1968, known among collectors and machinists today simply as the 2G, is generally considered to have been the last real gasp of Van Norman's mainstream general-purpose machine tool line, a genuinely capable machine, factory-equipped with ground ball screws, advanced controls, and full power feed, but priced at roughly 4 times what a comparably capable Bridgeport cost at the time, without matching the Bridgeport's versatility, a competitive position that made it clear the general machine tool market was no longer where Van Norman's real future was headed. By 1970, a Department of Defense document identified Van Norman as a subsidiary of Gulf and Western Industries, confirming just how far the ownership chain had drifted from the 2 watch tool brothers, who had started the whole enterprise less than 100 years earlier. rather than competing head-on in the general machine tool market against larger, better capitalized builders, who could out-invest Van Norman in exactly the kind of research and tooling the Ram-type mill line would have needed to stay competitive. The company appears to have made a deliberate, quieter decision, somewhere in this period, to lean into the one part of its business where it had built a genuinely durable, less contested position: the automotive service and engine rebuilding equipment nobody else specialized in quite as thoroughly or had quite as long a head start building. Even that narrower business kept fragmenting over time, though. One product line sold off at a time, rather than the whole company going at once, the way it so often did elsewhere in this history. In 1972, Van Norman sold its precision external centerless grinder line outright to the Bryant Grinder Corporation, another established name in the same corner of the industry, handing over an entire category of equipment the company had built and refined for decades. A transaction significant enough to be recorded in Bryant's own later corporate history, but modest enough that it barely registered as news anywhere else at the time. The general milling machine business essentially wound down over the following years without any single dramatic closure announcement, leaving the automotive service equipment, the boring bars, the brake lathes, the grinders that mechanics actually depended on every working day, as the core of whatever remained of Van Norman as a genuine operating identity, rather than simply a legal entity buried inside a much larger conglomerate's paperwork. By the mid-1980s, Van Norman had ceased to exist as an independent company in any meaningful sense at all, its various remaining pieces having been sold off individually rather than the whole business changing hands as a single unit, the way most companies in this history did when their end finally came. The automotive repair equipment portion, the boring bars, the brake lathes, the crankshaft and cam grinders that had built the company's real, lasting reputation in garages and repair shops across the country over more than half a century, was purchased by Quickway, an Iowa-based company founded in 1920 in Marion that had itself pioneered some of the earliest dedicated valve refacing equipment in the trade and understood exactly what it was buying, having competed alongside Van Norman in the same specialized corner of the machine tool industry for decades before finally absorbing part of its former rival's product line outright. Quickway still sells tools and machinery under the Van Norman name today, meaning a company with no historical connection whatsoever to Charles and Fred Van Norman or to Springfield, Massachusetts, now controls the single most recognizable remaining piece of their actual legacy. Decades after the men who founded the original firm had died, the fragmentation did not stop there. The Van Norman rotary surface grinder line, the machines used to resurface worn engine flywheels rather than replace them outright, eventually passed to Iron-Tite Products Incorporated of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, which by 2014 was manufacturing that equipment under license and had also acquired the rights to Van Norman's brake lathe line, though Iron-Tite later discontinued brake lathe production entirely as the market for resurfacing worn brake drums and rotors dwindled in an era of cheap, easily replaceable brake parts that made resurfacing an increasingly hard service to sell to cost-conscious customers. A separate company, Repair Parts Incorporated, supplied original equipment replacement parts for aging Van Norman machines, still in daily service across the country for years afterward. An entire small business built around nothing more than keeping decades-old Van Norman equipment running for shops that had no interest in replacing machines that still worked perfectly well, apparently continuing that support into the early 2010s before its own inventory and equipment were finally sold off at auction around 2015, closing out what may have been the very last dedicated commercial operation built specifically around the original Van Norman product line. Even the physical evidence of the company's century in Springfield eventually changed hands in its own quiet, unremarkable way. The original plant at 3640 Main Street, sitting next to a wartime Bosch facility where local women had once done assembly work during the Second World War, stood empty for years after Van Norman's operations wound down, before finally being renovated into a medical facility rather than demolished. One more small, almost gentle transformation in a company history built almost entirely out of them. A building that once ground engine parts to precise tolerances, now quietly caring for patients instead. There is no single villain in this story, the way there so often is elsewhere in this history. No aggressive conglomerate swooping in to strip a company for parts in one hostile takeover. No dramatic bankruptcy judge signing off on a factory's final closure while reporters wait outside. No last chairman writing a tearful farewell letter to employees as the last of the company's money ran out. Van Norman simply kept selling off pieces of itself, patiently and repeatedly, for the better part of 6 decades. First into the orbit of Universal American, then into Gulf and Western sprawling and largely unrelated media and industrial empire, then out again into Bryant Grinder for the centerless grinders, then Quick Way for the automotive equipment that had always been the company's real heart, then Iron Tight for the flywheel grinders and what remained of the brake lathe business, each individual transaction modest and unremarkable enough on its own that no single moment in that whole long sequence looks like the ending when you are standing inside it. It is only when you step back and look at the entire span at once. Watch repair tools in a small Waltham shop in 1874, all the way to a courthouse full of scattered parts catalogs and small regional manufacturers in the 2000s, that the true shape of the thing becomes visible at all. A genuine, sustained industrial dissolution, stretched out so slowly across so many small, individually defensible transactions that it never once looked, from the inside, like the kind of company-ending event that gets written about anywhere. At the time, it was actually happening. And yet somewhere along that long, quiet chain, the actual company, the one Charles and Fred Van Norman built out of watch repair tools in a small Waltham, Massachusetts shop in 1874, did stop existing as anything a person could point to and call a single business, even though pieces of what it built are still, in a real and entirely literal sense, doing exactly the work they were designed to do. A mechanic in a small town garage today can still buy a Van Norman branded flywheel grinder or brake lathe part from a company in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, that has never once had any contact with Springfield, Massachusetts, and can still occasionally find a decades-old Van Norman boring bar or milling machine running perfectly well in a shop that has owned it since before most of the mechanics currently using it were even born, still doing the same job it was built to do generations ago, without anyone in the room knowing or particularly caring who built it. The name outlived the company by a wide margin, scattered now across 2 or 3 unrelated small manufacturers in the American Midwest, instead of one machine shop in New England, sold by people who never knew the 2 brothers who started it all, quietly proving that a company can, in its own particular and thoroughly unspectacular way, disappear so gradually and so incompletely that it never really finishes disappearing at all.